So with that background, we're finally going to move on to phenomenology itself.
Cool.
Yeah. So, so basically, Husserl, the reason I mentioned Kant or talked about Kant so much was because it was very important to Husserl's intellectual context.
Hmm.
And like Husserl would have been immersed in the Neo-Kantian school at Freiburg, which included um, Rickert, which was, he's pictured there. Rickert was the professor that Husserl succeeded. And the Neo-Kantians, including Rickert, basically returned to Kant after a century of speculative metaphysics, including like Hegelian idealism, like this guy Hegel pictured above, where like they tried to like explain everything from the side of idealism, which they thought was just sort of useless and speculative, and they thought philosophy needed to take scientific evidence and experience more seriously, and not just extrapolate too much. So there was a return to Kant and a more like rigorous scientific version of philosophy, and they also like wanted to correct some misinterpretations of Kant as they saw it. Like in the 19th century, they like the century just preceding them, there was a understanding that Kant described these like psychological realities almost, or the nature of the mind, and they thought that the categories must be objective in some sense. They must be like independent of psychological factors. Um, and there are also these revolutions in natural science that sort of upset Kant's foundations, like Kant's metaphysical propositions, basically. So yeah, I said we were gonna mention Einstein, so here he is. So yeah, basically, it, Husserl was the one who claimed there was like a crisis of the European sciences, but like there was just sort of like all philosophers recognized that because of developments in natural science, there was sort of an upset of the basic foundations that had been laid for philosophy. So the reason for this was, as we said, Kant's philosophy it takes Newtonian mechanics for granted, and then it reinterprets them as conditions of experience, so that like the space and time and the principles of causality that Newton mathematically explained are just principles of our experience, are just the way things appear to us. And Kant also importantly posited certain limits to scientific explanation or like metaphysical explanation. He thought like the critique of pure reason, it's a critique in the sense that it is establishing some limits. And he thought that scientific thought wouldn't inquire beyond space and time, that beyond that limit it would just be meaningless. And the big problem is that like Einstein did inquire beyond those limits, and everyone sort of agreed that it was very explanatory and helpful. But the question for philosophers was like, what are the metaphysical foundations that are left if science doesn't stop there? In fact, if you look at the some lectures that Einstein gave in Princeton, he actually mentions like the a priori foundations from Kant, and he says, sometimes like science has to go a little bit into the a priori and like revise things according to experiments. He acknowledged that he was like interfering with these foundations, but he thought it was necessary to explain some recent scientific evidence, which he was right about. But the question is like, yeah, what new foundations do we have? So basically, some Neo-Kantians just thought that you should just take like Kant's basic principles, that there are some a priori concepts, and just sort of alter them. Like this is what the early Carnap did. Like he just added like new forms of mathematics, like Riemannian geometry, and just said, with this stuff mixed in, the relativistic framework, like you still have, like you can still have like sort of a schema of like how things appear to us. Like you can still have the separation.
So basically, the philosophers are trying to adjust their theories based on the new physics findings.
Yeah, and they're sort of I mean, it goes a bit deeper than that because, like, the theory of relativity also changes the relationship between subject and object in a way. So they're, like, like they're also rethinking like where like what the categories mean, like where they exist within the realm of nature, basically. Um, but yeah, I think you can see in Carnap's early work where he's trying to he was basically doing like new mathematical deductions that tried to show like how there could be like a foundation sort of like a priori categories just with new like mathematical concepts. Like it's not Euclidean geometry anymore. It's more general than that. So yeah, they're just trying to adjust it to make room for these ideas. So yeah, but it's not very satisfactory because you're not really explaining like it's not really explaining like the why of like where do these principles of experience come from exactly. And this is why Husserl thought that like the Kantian system should go even deeper. Like he was never satisfied with the categories as an explanation because it was the sort of the question that all first students of Kant ask, like where did they come from exactly? Like why are they just assumed to be there? So he agrees with this method of transcendental deduction, which is like inquiring into what concepts make our experience possible. But he thinks it shouldn't stop at the categories, and he thought it was just sort of obscure metaphysical speculation. So he thought like to give science like a true foundation with respect to some revolutions, but like new scientific revolutions, but just in general, like he thought that science had to be grounded in experience, and he thought that Kant didn't recognize like an even more general principle that he calls intentionality that underlies all of conscious experience. So phenomenology is like sort of following Kant's program, but it's going even deeper and analyzing this more general principle. So yeah, so that brings us to intentionality, which is like the underlying principle of consciousness for Husserl. And in simple terms, it means that all conscious experience is consciousness of something. So every mental experience we have, like Kant, he thought that it was sort of a judgment. So like we perceive something, and he says in perception something is perceived. And then like that's sort of a basic just sensory experience. In a statement, we're stating something. And when we love something, we love something. When we hate something. So any sort of emotion or logical judgment has this directedness to it. So it's just, I redrew like the apple where it's just like an arrow. Or like Husserl thinks this is the only significant thing that has this particular polarity where it's just directed at some object. Like it's never just totally withdrawn from the world. It always has some sort of content.
Is this
even when you're dreaming,
different from the love like in religion? For example, like God's love is unconditional. It's just love.
Oh, well, it's funny you say that because, like Kant used to appeal to some theological ideas to show like why humans are different. Like humans are limited in a way that God's like experiences wouldn't be.
Also, not just gods, also Buddhas.
Yeah, I guess Buddhism would.
Buddhas are not gods.
No, but they can achieve a state of enlightenment where I guess in a way they look beyond things like this.
Yeah.
But Husserl wouldn't agree with that. Maybe I guess that shows some of his like Western theological influence. But he believes that like humans are fundamentally limited. That this is like there is this limited format in which things appear, and their experience can't really transcend this. And that's also very Kantian, but this is also I think what Kant has in common with some of the early like Christian scholastic thinkers. That there's some difference between like the divine experience and human experience. Yeah.
So these are the unenlightened human experience.
If you're an Orthodox Buddhist, yeah, you might say that. Yeah. In fact, we could talk about this some other day. There's an interesting, like Neo-Confucian philosopher, Mu Zongzang, who, like, yeah, believes that like Eastern thought was like thinking through the noumenon, like it did look beyond phenomena. So he thought that like Eastern thought had gone beyond Kant's limits in a productive way. Yeah.
That's why we have all the Chinese translations.
Well, because this was made for a Chinese audience. But yeah, so yeah, interesting related topic, theology. So yeah, anyways, intentionality he thinks is the really important principle in phenomenology. And like the categories, it's like the most general principle of any object. It characterizes the appearance of any object in general. Like it attaches to every experience. And it's more generic than the categories. And even things that are like not real, like he often talks about phantasms, like if you have a hallucination, if you're thinking about some mythical creature, things that don't exist, like that's a valid intention too. So it encompasses like pretty much every aspect of our cognitive life for Husserl.